This is Dave Bortner, Freedom Boat Service. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary in business, and we happened to run across these cassette tapes that were produced as part of the Antique Motor Boating Symposium, March 31st through April 2nd of 1995 at the Mariners Museum. We thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to digitize these presentations by icons and luminaries of our hobby. We hope you enjoy listening to them and join us in celebrating our 10 years in business. Thanks. This final tape is a discussion of the early runabouts by Tom Crew, Chris Smith, and Wayne Mocksfield. Of course, anything that has to do with Chris Smith is always entertaining, as you may have heard in the background of some of the other files. But this is a great discussion about the early runabout.
About them, and some of the extreme details are mainly because there's fewer of them in existence. And some of the magazine advertising of Chris Craft, or Chris Smith & Sons Boat Company as it was known, that I found were vital to documenting this presentation. So to help me with this, I've asked Wayne Mocksfield, who you met earlier and throughout the weekend, owner of Wayne's Marine and professional restorer and owner of hull number 6, one of the earliest ones. And I've asked Mr. Smith, Chris Smith, to also sit in and offer his commentary, what he knows about the older boats, and he's also intimately familiar with the Miss Belle Isle displayed here in the museum. That was hull 70, because he was involved with when Chris Craft acquired that hull, late 60s, early 70s. So I'm just going to have them provide their commentary when they see the opportunity using the cordless mic, and we'll see how that works. All right, we'll have the first slide now. Thanks. This is the earliest advertising that I've been able to locate now. Okay, we don't have complete issues of all of magazines, but this is from 1915 Powerboat magazine. Excuse me, we can hear you in the back. I don't want to pick you up on the microphone here. Thank you. It says, "Let me build you a Smith boat." And this is at a time when Chris Smith was still building and heavily involved in racing. But now he's also advertising the fact that he will build launches, runabouts, express cruisers, and hydroplanes. Of course, he also mentions in the advertising using or playing on his racing success with the Baby Reliance and the Baby Speed Demon. I think this was also the beginning of the Miss Detroit series. 1915. Basically, the runabouts and launches at this time would have been displacement hulls. This is the Miss Detroit number 2, photographed at the Minneapolis Gold Cup race in 1917. It was 20 feet long, had a 250 horsepower Stirling engine, and won that race at a speed of 62 miles an hour. Oh, we're losing focus. We'll try the next one. And somebody's going to have to stay with it. There we go. This is a very rare photograph showing the interior of Chris Smith & Sons boathouse in Algonac with the Miss Detroit number 2 out of the water. You notice try to use this pointer, the bow rudder right here out of the water, and the hide propeller here at the stern. It's one of the few photographs you'll see of a Smith hydroplane out of the water. We're lucky enough to have that here. This is a photograph you've seen used numerous times showing Chris Smith observing the Gold Cup race in the Detroit River in 1919. He was probably watching his own Miss Detroit number 4 win that race, which was a culmination of 6 straight victorious years. He might also have been thinking about a cruiser that he had under construction. Very few people know about, and I lucked into, not by myself. I did have a lead, but let me read you a little bit about that boat. It was completed in 1919. This information I'm reading to you from the Lloyd's American Yacht Register of 1920. The name of the cruiser was the Hourless, Hourless. It was 80 feet long. Chris Craft at its height never built a standard 80-foot cruiser. Here, Chris Smith and Sons designed and built an 80-foot cruiser in 1919. It had twin Murray and Tregurtha gasoline engines. The cruiser was built for Walter E. Flanders of Detroit. I tried to follow this cruiser through the Lloyd's registers, and it disappeared in 1947 by that name. It could have had a name change. There's no way to cross-reference name changes in Lloyd's. But up to 1947, it was known as the Hourless, and whether or not it still exists, I don't know. So if anyone, you suspect you've seen an 80-foot Chris Craft, let me know.
Tom, could we go back to the Miss Detroit hanging up?
Yes, sir.
I've got an interesting story on the bow rudder. The first hydroplane that they built this way, now, I didn't know it. This is stories I get from my family, Dad, of course. They came up on the step, and the back of the boat came completely free. Of course, the rudder did too, so they didn't have any steering. But they were in a hurry to get this boat in a race, so they quickly disconnected the steering, put the rudder in the bow, put a cross member just on the top, put somebody in that hatch, and he drove it around the race course with his feet. The guys in the back were just running the throttles. Thank you, Tom.
This is a photograph of Chris and his sons Bernard and Jay, shown in September of 1920, with the caption of Chris Smith and his boys, and Chris was acknowledged as the Wizard of Algonac. At this time, they were about to race and win the Harmsworth Trophy with the Miss America #1, and certainly by 1920, Chris Smith was acknowledged for his great success in Gold Cup and hydroplane racing. I think the term fits, the Wizard of Algonac.
The expression on JW and my dad's face looked like they just missed the race.
There we go. Now this is the earliest magazine advertising I've been able to find after the new Runabout company was established by Chris Smith and Sons Boat Company. The date is just off the screen, but it's April 1922, Motorboat Magazine. And notice at the very bottom, if you have to stand up, they're advertising the Chris Smith Craft. So this is probably the first time you see that term used, the Chris Smith Craft. And also notice in the fine print, for all of you who thought Chris Craft only built 26-footers in the early to mid-20s, look more closely. They also offered a 24-footer, which would reach a speed of 18 miles an hour at a cost of $2,200. They offered two different types of 26-footers, one with a forward drive double cockpit and one with a rear drive single cockpit. The first was $3,000, the second was $2,800. And finally, they offered a 33-foot Baby Gar, reaching a speed ranging from 50 to 60 miles per hour at a price of $7,500. Many of you may not be familiar with the fact that Chris Smith built many of the early Garwood boats, particularly the Baby Gar, 33 feet. Now, what was the first Chris Craft? From the account records that we have, Colonel Vincent purchased the first boat from Chris Smith and Sons, and it was a race boat, Packard Chris Craft. Here shown winning the Gold Cup race, 1922. We have the original specifications for that boat. It was simply referred to as a 26-foot Gold Cup. It was built at a cost of $3,500 with the dimensions of 26 feet by 6 feet by 2 feet. It's powered by a 6-cylinder Packard Gold Cup engine, 200 horse, and would reach a speed of 45.6 miles an hour. So we have all the original table of offsets and specifications for that boat. When I was trying to find a good slide of the Packard Chris Craft, I ran across this photo in Yachting magazine. It illustrated that very race. You see the Packard Chris Craft in the upper left, the white hull. But this one down here intrigued me. I knew I'd seen that G31 number somewhere. And the name of the boat is Chris Craft number 2. This is the boat which you've seen in the Legend of Chris Craft. We have the print here, but we never knew exactly what it was. It's Chris Craft number 2. There's the racing number, G31. Same boat. Single cockpit forward. The engine vents are on the covering boards, out away from the seat backs. Pleated upholstery, wicker chairs. This is the second runabout built, we believe. And I'm also looking up information on the race. George Wood was the driver of Chris Craft number 2, and it was equipped with a 180 horsepower A7A model Hall Scott aviation engine. And it came in, well, it didn't finish. It apparently missed a buoy and was flagged, so it was disqualified from the race. But I thought that was a really neat discovery. After all these years, we're now able to put a name on this photograph, and I ran across this about 3 weeks ago. Has the globe for the stern pole. Up until that point, this was the earliest photograph. This is a box camera snapshot that turned up in the collection showing Chris Smith standing beside a very early hull. On the back of the photograph, it was identified as Mrs. Doc Sanborn and the name of the boat, the All-Star. Well, Doc Sanborn was certainly a friend of the Smith family and was probably involved with some of their racing activities. It was Dr. William, or I don't know if it's William, but it's W.E. Sanborn. All-Star turns out to be identified as hull number 4 in our purchase ledger for the early Chris Craft records. It did have a Curtiss OX5 engine, and so we're now able to put a hull number on this boat. It's a little bit different from the Chris Craft number 2. The large engine vents are behind the front seat and slightly more elevated than the other because it has a different engine housing. I don't want to guess what's in this, but it's an interesting.
I can tell you what it's used for, Tom. They're
Okay.
christening the boat, and she's going to hand that stick and knock it on the bow
Okay.
in the cutwater and break it.
Well, to supplement this photograph, I found a magazine ad of the All-Star, April 1924. And this is the first time we see the hyphenated Chris Craft name. Now, at this time, they're referring to the 26-foot model as the Chris Craft. The company is not known as Chris Craft at this time, but it's called the Chris Craft, meaning the boat. And the detail of the boat here of the same model here at the bottom of the ad. No windshield at this time. Pleated upholstery. 2 side vents as well as the 4 large ventilators on top. No lifting ring, which is kind of unusual. Let me back up here for one of these others. No lifting ring, tied off on the bow light. No white deck stripes. Some people go overboard painting white deck stripes on their boats. Early on, they had the dark seams, it was not white till later in about 1929.
If you're interested in how we lifted and launched the boats in those days, we lifted up the seat both in the front cockpit and way in the back and hooked the chain hoist to a bracket that was attached to the engine stringers full length. So really we could lift them, but it wasn't a visible lifting ring.
We also have the original 1922 specifications for the early runabout model. 26 feet by 6 feet 6 inches. It was later increased to 6 feet 8 inches with a draft of 24 inches. Forward cockpit seating capacity for 3 people, aft cockpit seating for 5, including 2 wicker chairs. Bottom was double-planked mahogany with an inner skin, blue upholstery, and gray linoleum. Let's see, I think I have a slide of this. Yes. That's the handwritten original specifications for the standard 26-foot runabout of 1922. And I'm sure was the standard for several more years after that. This is page 2. And I'll just mention briefly that 1 bow chock brass, 1 small clamshell brass, headlight brass, 6 2-inch brass cleats, 1 8-inch brass cleat. A lot of brass on this boat. It's not stainless or chrome. 2 chocks brass, 4 large brass vents, 4 small brass vents. So the brass hardware was standard at this time. The Curtiss engine, we've mentioned in other sessions, was the standard engine at this time. It was readily available following World War I, and it provided the power needed for these boats. Apparently, the marine engines available at that time did not provide the power necessary. Curtiss OX5, 90 horsepower, 1,400 RPM. And this is the illustration of that. One of the oldest boats in existence is hull number 6. We're lucky enough to have the owner of that boat with us tonight. Many of you may have seen this illustration on the cover of the fall issue of the Brass Bell. The Godfather. It's owned by Wayne Mocksfield. Wayne, you want to tell us a little bit about your research and how long it took you to find the boat and restore it?
Well, back in the late 70s, I made some trips to New Hampshire and met a fellow up there by the name of Bruce Bernard, who had a fantastic collection of old boats, and among these boats was number 6. I visited him frequently and always said that I really would like to have that boat. And I guess Bruce got tired of me nagging at him and finally consented to sell me the boat. From what I understand, it came from Detroit, Michigan. That's where he found it. And he also, at this particular time, you people should know that he is the owner of hull number 4, which is actually in the process of being restored at this time. In your former presentation there, Tom, you mentioned that in the first article or advertisement about the Chris Crafts, they said that it drove from the rear cockpit, and I just found out yesterday or over this weekend that number 4, according to Bruce, does have all the original instrument panel in there and was actually a rear-driven boat to start with.
That's
it would
great.
be interesting to know how, I guess, what was the All-Star actually turned into a front drive at that particular time. Was there any date on that picture with the All-Star with Chris Smith and
No.
Mrs. whatever? It would be interesting to know exactly when that happened. Anyway, I got this boat from Bruce back in the late 70s, and with running the boatyard and all, it took a long time before I actually got around to restore the boat. When I bought the boat from Bruce, I did not get an engine with it, and the deal was that once I started the restoration, Bruce would see that I got an engine for the boat. He had several of them, not all Chris Craft conversion OX5s, but actually I got the restoration underway in 1991, and I must confess that I did not do all of the woodwork on the boat. Another friend of mine, who I had met up at New Hampshire, was out of work at the time, and I had seen some of the woodwork that he did, and it definitely met my standards. And the name of that individual was Charles Gath. I gave him the boat at that time and gave him a bunch of wood and said, "Go to work, Charlie." And it took a few years because he wound up doing some other little things in between. Anyway, the boat came to me in the fall of '93, and at that time I started all of the finish work on it and all of the detail work, and I went to Florida the end of November, the beginning of December, and came back in March and continued working on the boat, and finally had it finished in July. I might also add that I guess it was, must have been around '92 when Bruce found out that I had started this restoration work on the boat, that he contracted with John Clark to get some of these OX5 engines put together. And he gave me my choice of the engines that he had, and I naturally picked the Chris Craft conversion. And one of the very super interesting things that we found out after the fact was that in going through your files, Tom, here at the museum, we found that number 6 had been sold several times. Originally, when the boat was purchased, Garwood purchased number 6 and number 7. And maybe most of you people don't know, but Chris Craft, or Chris Smith, actually acted as a dealer back then. When you didn't want your boat anymore, or you wanted another one, you went back to Chris, and he actually took your boat in trade. And by going through the files in the alphabetical manner in which the records were kept, we found that this boat had been brought back to the factory in 1924 and updated. And at that time, engine number 48 was put in the boat. And this Chris Craft engine, number 48, that I got from Bruce, happens to be what I consider close to the original engine for the boat.
That's amazing.
There is no real record that we can see of what engine was put in it when Garwood purchased the boat on October 25th of 1922. Who knows what was in it at that time.
It's remarkable.
Anyway, John Clark took about a year and a half to restore the engine. It was done with tremendous detail and great care. And we put the engine in it, and it fired up instantly, absolute instant fire. And the tachometer was not with the boat. I did come up with the original Indian-type gauges for the oil pressure and amp meter. The tachometer I purchased from Peter Henkel, and it is basically the original type tack. The original dashboard and everything had 3 little notches in it, and this is exactly how the tack goes into the instrument panel itself. We tried to pull everything back exactly the way the different illustrations and pictures that we had gotten from the Mariners Museum here. And I think it's a true representation of what the boat was really like at that time. I did get a windshield from Bruce for the boat. The windshield was on the boat at the time that Bruce got it. In talking to Tom and researching these old advertisements and stuff, we found that the windshield really did not go on the boat until 1925. So I elected not to put it on the boat, even though I have it all restored and so on and so forth. It's a magnificent piece, and that was one of the big things that turned me on to this boat, was the way this windshield was designed and how it looked. You may wonder where the name Godfather came from. It was on the boat when I got it. That was the name that was on the boat, and I just kind of thought it was kind of fitting and proper for the boat of that era to have that name. It's just a great machine. At this particular time, at top RPMs, it turns up about 1,700, and it's a little bit too much for it. According to the specifications of the engine, it's supposed to turn about 1,400 RPMs. The original literature says that it should swing an 1826 prop, and I have a 1724 on it. It is a left-hand drive also, which is very interesting. Everything kind of handles very well, even though it is a left-handed drive. That is a picture of the engine before it went into the boat. And if you notice, you have a super massive flywheel housing back there, and the transmission looks like the A70 and A120 transmissions. And it has its own separate reservoir, and it couples up to the engine. Very primitive, very prehistoric. And when I put the engine in the boat, after we had the floorboards all set and everything, I decided to cut out a section of the floorboard right where the transmission is, so that all of the spectators at the boat show could see that transmission. That's about the only thing in the floorboards that isn't exactly the way it was in day one. One other thing that I might mention is the starter motor. You see that into the flywheel housing there. It does not have a solenoid. You must pull a lever to engage the drive on the starter motor, and then hit the electricity, and and away it goes. The Miss Belle Island inside here has a generator also mounted into the other side of the flywheel, on the other side of the engine in the back there. This boat, the generator mounted on the stringer up in front and was driven with a chain. Very primitive, but it does work. You can't see from this photo, but the water pump is also mounted up in the front, and the generator sprocket actually drives off of part of the shaft on the water pump. I know Bruce is here today. If he's in the back, if he would like to come forward and
Bruce,
say a few words about some of these things. He is a person who's been involved with the old boats for many, many, many years and has a tremendous collection himself.
come up, Bruce. Tell us what you know, which is a lot. So this is a John Clark restoration on the engine?
John Clark did 3 engines at the same time. I had accumulated 4 engines over the years. This one Chris Craft, which came from Pete Henkel, several gearboxes, in various stages of disrepair that came from cars. Some of them were out of cars, I understood. Mark Mason had one, Pete Henkel had another one, and I think we found another one somewhere else. And so John took all of those and scavenged the pieces to make this gearbox. The other 3 engines were all capital conversions, 2 of which were apart, but in pretty decent condition. The parts were in pretty decent condition, and the third one was one that Mark Mason found under a porch down in the Tidewater area, and it had been underneath in the tide. And so we had 2 engines that were all in pieces, and one that I don't think John Clark ever got apart. And so John did an engine for me and this engine, and then he was doing another engine for somebody else, and it took him hundreds and hundreds of hours. And they are not just pretty on the outside. They're completely all redone inside with the bearings as needed, all new piston rings as needed, everything done and rebuilt as needed. And I think he even had to make new manifolds for yours, didn't he, Wayne?
Yes. After he ran it the first time, he found that he had to make new manifolds.
I'm presently working on hull 60, which is identical to Miss Belle Isle, and we're going to put the capital conversion in that. The capital conversion, what they did is the aircraft engine, the end of the aircraft engine where it tapers in here, the propeller on the airplane would have been right here, where this flywheel casting is. And Chris Craft used these engines are dry. Is this one dry sump, Wayne, or not? It's not dry sump. No, it's not dry. Okay. And this is something that John told me a couple of weeks ago that I couldn't believe. The original OX5s that they flew in the Curtis Jenny were not dry sump. And the object of what a dry sump engine is, you have an oil reservoir, and as the oil is used in the engine, it is collected in the pan, pumped to this reservoir, and then pumped from the reservoir into the engine, so that you have very little oil in the pan. The object being is when you turn your airplane upside down, it doesn't drown in oil. And I didn't believe John when he told me this, but apparently the original aircraft engine was not dry sump. And what Capital did is they took the lower base, or the pan, which is also the parting line of the crank. In other words, the lower base is a very heavy casting. The lower base is a very heavy casting, and this parting line here is the center line of the crank. And the lower bearing shells sit in the lower case, and the crank is dropped in, and then the upper bearing shells go on top of that and the upper base. And what Capital did was to throw away the lower base and make a whole lower base that ran the whole length of the engine, including their gear, and set the gear, the flywheel, and everything on this lower base, which makes a much more streamlined conversion. Whether it's any better or not, I don't know, but we'll see. They also increased the compression ratio of the engines by screwing a steel plate on the top of each cylinder with 4 steel wood screws. And all of the Capital engines that John took apart had this. The Wayne's engine didn't. It's for a lower compression fuel. I don't know what they had for octane back there, but it must have been very, very, very low. Another interesting thing about this engine is the rocker arms for the intake and exhaust valves. There's one valve and there's the other valve. Are all externally operated, and one is a pull, and one is a push, so that the cam rather than just lifting pulls the other way for the other valve. And I'm not an engine person, so I really can't tell you more about it than that. But they weighed about 300 pounds. It's an aircraft engine. They weigh, I'm guessing, somewhere around 500 or 600 pounds. This conversion here is probably heavier than the Capital because it has a massive flywheel and everything on it. It's quite a light engine. It supposedly puts out 90 horsepower at about 12 or 1400 RPM, I'm told. And but it managed to push these boats about 35 miles an hour, and it swings the same propeller as my 26-footer with the 427 Chris Craft engine with a 1.5 to 1 gear. It swings the same size propeller, albeit a little bit slower. So anyway, that's the engine part of it.
I remember seeing this boat last summer up at Clayton, and when Wayne started it up, all those exterior rocker arms reminded me of a sewing machine. We're just going.
I might add that on each one of those rocker assemblies there are a total of 10 little holes that must receive a drop of oil, basically according to the manual, every time you run it. John convinced me to put a few little drops of synthetic oil in there and eventually hope that it works its way into the metal, and we may not have to oil it as frequently. It is not as messy as many people think it is. When I put the drop of oil in there, if I'm a little sloppy and it starts to run around a little bit, I usually just wipe it off a bit. But it is not as messy as you may think that it could be. As Bruce was saying, that he's swinging the same size prop on his big 454 or whatever that engine was in the newer Chris-Craft, and here's this little 90 horsepower engine swinging the same size propeller. So you can just imagine the torque that this thing really has.
Right.
When the boat runs and it sits there at the dock, there is quite a vibration set up, and you can see the water alongside of the boat at the waterline actually jumping up in the air about an inch or so. That's how much vibration there is to the boat. I might add that in the restoration of the boat, it was taken apart piece by piece, starting with the bottom, and we did manage to save 11 frames in the boat. 11 frames are original, and the upper part of the stem is original. Everything else was replaced piece by piece using the 5200 method.
And where's the hull number stamped on the boat?
The hull number was stamped on the seat, on the front seat, underneath the boards where you flipped it up. That's where it was. My boat did have a lifting ring in the front, and I did add one to the rear just for the ease of handling. Outside of that, the boat is exactly the way it was when it came from the factory.
You did an excellent job. To supplement all of this, I've also ran across a small article about Chris Smith and Sons going into production. Motorboat Magazine, May 1924. At this time, this was a photograph illustrating that article with the caption saying, "A windshield is now part of the standard equipment for the 26-foot Chris-Craft. 50 of these boats are in production." So you'll notice the curved bottom windshield, same or similar type as what's on the Miss Belle Isle, and I'll tell you there's a slight difference. Note 2, the plain step pads. Remember Joe Cabot mentioned yesterday, the early boats had the plain step pads. They were not stamping Chris-Craft on it at this time. Another single cockpit forward, ribbed upholstery, both the large ventilators and the smaller side vents. The difference here in the windshield and what's on the Miss Belle Isle is there's no dividing, no bracket or dividing the windshield. It's solid glass, curved bottom to fit the splashboard. I've forgotten now. Is this the smaller stanchions or the larger stanchions? Smaller stanchions. The one on the Miss Belle Isle has the metal bracket dividing the windshield and the taller stanchions, and somebody help me with the dimensions between large and small. The smaller are what, about 12 inches? 15 inches?
The small one, I think, are 15 and the tall are 17.
Smaller are 15 and the taller are 17 inches. So that's the type you'll see on the Miss Belle Isle. Wanted to read too. It said the boat is 26 feet overall, 6 feet 8 inches in extreme beam. Remember I mentioned earlier the 1922 version was 6 feet 6, so now they've widened the boat 2 inches with a 24-inch draft. There are 2 cockpits, the forward one containing the helmsman's seat, the other one with a cushioned seat with a lazy back, and the after end and the rest left clear for chairs. The Curtiss OX5 engine is standard, 8-cylinder, 100 horsepower, 1,600 RPM. So they've increased the power of that engine. And with a Bosch battery, Delco electric starter, Exide generator, Zenith carburetor, deck hardware of polished brass, and 2 wicker chairs came with your boat. Now this is very similar to that description. This is the Thelma H. We were able to identify this just like the All-Star, going back to the purchase ledger. Well, I assumed that H must have been the initial of the last name of the buyer. Turned out to be George Holman. The delivery date was June 1925, hull number 15. That sounds kind of late to be hull number 15, so we're not sure when it was built, but it was delivered in June of 1925. But it does have the proper windshield. No lifting ring. Don't understand, some had, because in the ads you'll see later, some have the lifting ring up on the foredeck, so I don't know why some had it and some didn't. I'm sorry? the lower windshield. Thank you.
Does that boat show a hatch on the front deck? Is that the knob just off to the left of the front light?
Right there? I think that's a blemish or a reflection.
Okay, because my boat does have a front hatch, and it is, as it was constructed, it looks totally original.
Let me back up one slide, too. We were talking about lifting rings. There's nothing on this one either.
I think you can see the edge of the hatch.
Well, yeah, there's the edge of the hatch. That's right. The storage hatch right there. Hull number 15. Yes.
Some of the research I've done, it seems like Chris Craft practiced the last in, first out method of inventory. So that boat could have been built in 23 and put in the back of the warehouse, and they didn't sell enough out to get it out from out. So that's very likely how the numbering got out of sequence of what you would expect it to be the boat.
Very likely. Boats were built on speculation and waiting to be sold. Just to kind of document photographically, instead of just relying on advertisements, this is a Chris Craft, well, it's not an all Chris Craft runabout, but it's a runabout race in the Detroit River. This is Detroit Yacht Club in the background. And this is a Chris Craft, this is a Chris Craft with a single cockpit forward, with the windshield and without, large rear cockpit. This could be some type of hacker, I'm not sure. Tom Flood, what do you think? The Belle Isle Bearcat or Belle Isle Boat Company? Similar. And then this one. This is an all Chris Craft race, mid-20s. This one here, you can't see it very well, but the windshield's been removed, but the stanchions are there. I think this must be in 1925 or so. Remember, I was reading in that article where they had the two cockpits forward, where here you are. That's the same thing as Miss Belle Isle. Then you have others, Chris's, with the single cockpit, so you've got a nice mixture here. Now, this is one of the original snapshots taken of the Miss Belle Isle when it won the 1969 contest to find the oldest living Chris Craft. I'm not sure where this was taken, but it was approximately 1969. Joe used a few of these yesterday.
When we found this boat, Tom, we brought it back to Algonac. Now, the manufacturing department in Algonac had all moved to Florida, and they were really in the process of tearing the offices down. And this was put right in the office.
Oh.
We had a store there at one time, and we had a big loading dock that we could roll it in from the back.
Thank you. Taller stanchions, has the support piece in the center of the windshield. Still ribbed upholstery in 1925. The large ventilators have been removed at this time. You just have them on the side, just plain step pads. Have a lifting ring now on the bow, the foredeck. Just a couple more shots. Still, the Belle Isle still has its original leather upholstery in it. Dog bone gas caps. Just have the large 8-inch cleat in the back. No lifting ring there. And, of course, Chris Smith. We assume this is the owner, Mr. Gerald, who owned the boat, and then A.W. McCare. Another photograph of Detroit River showing the 1925 version of the Chris Craft. You can't quite see it, but there is the dividing piece here in the windshield. I show this. This is February 1925 to illustrate that Chris Craft was going into high production and they were advertising that they're standardizing their production in order to reduce cost. They say that 2 years ago, this same boat was $7,200, and now it can be purchased for $3,200. So volume production and standardization combined to reduce the cost. Curtis engine still being advertised, and Chris Craft hyphenated now becoming more in use. Chris Craft also introduced the time payment plan in order to buy your boat. Apparently no one else was offering this method of payment at this time, and this was March of 1925. So for $1,340 down, you too can own a Chris Craft. Wayne mentioned earlier, here it says you purchase your Chris Craft directly from the factory. There were no dealers at this time. February 1926 shows a 1925 design boat with the large stanchions and the divider in the windshield. The price had increased to $3,500. It's in the text. And anyone who thinks Chris Craft didn't spend money on advertising, pay attention to these ads. These are quite elaborate. Available. If anyone sees such a thing, please donate it to the Mariners Museum. Our earliest known catalog is 1928, so if you find a 1926, come see me. This is probably the best photo we have, just generally showing a 1926 or an early 27 model.
Not very level writing there. Looks more like a Garwood.
(1926). They still have the ribbed upholstery. Note too, if any of you have one of these early hulls, I didn't point it out in any of the others, the boot top comes out should be painted over the cutwater and not stop short of the cutwater. They changed that later, but at this time, and we have many photographs, even the New York Boat Show photos, 1928, they painted the waterline boot top stripe over the cutwater. So if you want yours to be a little more accurate, you should try to do that. I don't know how difficult it is to keep the paint on the metal, but that's the way they did it. Yes?
No, the cutwater went right on down. The painter just carried the tape, or he didn't even use tape in those days, I'm sure. They just painted right around the chrome, and it did fall off. It didn't stay on very long.
Okay, you could be a little practical, I guess. This is the last slide. This was Joe's Guess What It Is shot, but I use it because it's the only photograph we have of Chris Smith in a boat. Thank you very much.
Should I talk about finding Miss Bell?
Excuse me?
Should I talk about it?
Sure, go ahead.
Maybe you'd like to know how we found the Miss Belle Isle. Somebody in the sales department back in 68, 69, I don't know when, probably Gordon Hauser, if he was there then, came up with the idea of let's try to find the oldest Chris Craft in the best condition, and we'll take it to the New York Boat Show in whatever that was, maybe January, February, whatever time that came up. So we put ads in all the magazines stating that we were looking for the oldest Chris Craft in the best condition, and if we could borrow it for the show, we would give you a brand new 23-foot Lancer, which was one of the fiberglass speedboats at that time. So we got over 400 entries. Now, A.W. McCare had been retired. He was the vice president in charge of engineering at that time, but he still had an office at the Pompano plant and a secretary, I assume, because she cataloged all these letters and pictures. We required a picture, of course, when we put in the ad, and put them in a notebook, and it wasn't too hard to cut them down to half. So unbeknownst to me, I knew this was going on through reading the magazines. Unbeknownst to me, Mac calls me up in Holland and says, come on over to Cleveland tomorrow, and I'll meet you at such and such a flight. So I jumped in my little plane and flew over, and we rented a car and got in a motel, and we sat down, and we started looking at these pictures. And it didn't take us too long, because so many of you people like to change Chris-Craft's designs. So there were so many of them that had different windshields, different motor boxes. Some of the triple cockpit jobs were cut out and made utilities out of. So you can imagine how easy it was to throw those out because they weren't in the original condition until we found a picture of the Miss Belle Isle. In fact, we were down to maybe 6 boats that we thought we were going to have to go look at. One was way up in the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, Murtaugh, and a couple in Detroit. And so we were in the Cleveland area, and we found this one which is in Akron, or Portage Lake, near Akron. So let's drive down there first. It was here, easy. And the two of us just couldn't believe it when we saw Miss Belle Isle way back in the shed, dirty and dark. It hadn't been out for I don't know how many years. And the rules were it had to run. So we got the marina, and just how much is it going to cost to move all these boats and get this thing in the water? And they were very friendly. We told them what we wanted to do, and we got hold of the owner, and he gave us permission to do it. And we went to lunch and came back about 2 o'clock, and they had the boat hanging in the slings. They couldn't take the slings off. She'd leak it too bad. And a new battery in it, and I'll be darned, the engine just started right up. Unbelievable. So Mac and I thought, this is it. I don't think we even have to look any further. So we made arrangements to truck the boat back to Algonac, and as I say, we put it we were tearing down a lot of the buildings at closed production in Algonac at that time, and we put it right in where the offices used to be. We had a showroom right on the highway 29 that went through into Algonac from Detroit, and with a plank I had to replace up forward, and I had a little trouble with the fender molding. When we took it off, it broke on us. So I had to make a new fender molding, and I said, how am I going to do this? So I kept looking at it and had my ruler in my pocket, being an engineer, and I thought, well, if we could find a stainless steel tubing so far, we can saw it in 2 and have that same shape. So that's what I did. The engineer of the machine shop didn't like the idea of sawing it in 2 for me, but they did, and I was able to take a section out of it and get it wasn't a true half round, it was less than a half round. Then we just drilled and countersunk it and screwed it on with, I don't know if we had straight slotted screws. I'll have to go back and look and see if we have the same screws or not. The upholstering is original. I called the Telelex down in Toledo. I think it was probably General Tire was the main company earlier, and I told him the problem. He said, send it down. We can recoat it. So we sent it down. Evidently, all he did is repaint it. And back again. So that's all original. The step pads, just as you see the boat, is just how we found it. So we thought we really had something. We took it to New York, and needless to say, it was a hit of the show. Everybody just raved so about it. And I guess after that, the board of directors of Chris-Craft at that time probably decided, let's buy it. Let's see if we can buy it. And he agreed to sell it to us. So Chris-Craft owned it after that. I thought you might be interested in that. And one other little thing I'd like to talk about, if I may. I hate to keep holding you up, but all my adult life I've been sporting this Chris-Craft scroll or emblem, whatever you want to call it. I even stole one out of the stock room and made a plastic license plate and had it in front of my convertibles for years and years and years. But I never knew what it stood for until Jeff came out with the Legends of Chris-Craft. Now, you probably all read that, but I'd like to read it to you again. I was so impressed with it. I'm going to come up here where I can set it down. It's a real tearjerker for me. You'll see why when I read it. Quoting directly from it now, I am the boat that brought a new day upon the water and a new ideal of boating to millions of people. I am safe always for you and your family to use and enjoy, for I have proven myself superior to all the rivals and all the conditions, time without number. My name has been blazoned upon motorboats which have won more competitive events than all others combined. I have speed, strength, the ability to outperform others and to outlive them. I am designed for sincerity, built with honesty, and endowed with the consistency of performance at all times, sold to you with truth and with the worthy of your loyal regard throughout the many long years you will use me. I am a Chris Kraft. I'm real proud of that.
Thank you, Chris. Well, it's been a wonderful weekend. I hope all of you have enjoyed it as much as we've had having you with us. I hope you'll come back again. Thank you. Enjoy your trip home.
Thanks for listening. Copyright 1995 by the Antique Boat Museum and the Antique and Classic Boat Society. Audio copyright 2019 Freedom Boat Service, LLC.